Good afternoon and welcome to Brainwash Festival, the weekend of collective loneliness. My name is Natasja van den Berg, and the coming hour we will discuss a brilliant book, The Lonely Century, with its author, Noreena Hertz. You can join in by sending your questions or comments by pushing the Ask a Question button in the lower part of your screen, and please do so. We are with, I think, approximately 600 people, so I hope lots of questions will be sent in to make it a really interesting afternoon. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we live in an age of loneliness. I mean, this is a festival with more than 600 people, and I'm here all alone in a studio in Amsterdam. There's an overemphasis on self-reliance, and that has placed our self-interest above that of our communities. And while we are or can be constantly connected with each other by our computers and telephones, we are lonelier than ever, research shows. And on top of that came the pandemic and the 1.5 meter society, and relationships with ourselves and others have only come under further pressure. The coming hour, we will discuss the causes of this loneliness, the consequences for ourselves and for society, and what we can do to overcome this individually and collectively. And we'll do that with a brilliant mind. Let me introduce her. She's here through video conferencing in her home in London, but she's Noreena Hertz, and she's an economist, best-selling author and professor. She has been named by The Observer as one of the world's leading thinkers and by Vogue magazine as one of the world's most inspiring women. Her new book, The Lonely Century, Coming Together in a World That's Pulling Apart, has been brilliantly reviewed in publications around the globe, including The Guardian, The Economist, The Financial Times, but also in Holland, in Netherlands, NRC. And Charlie Brooker, the creator of Black Mirror, the fantastic series, has said of the book that he found it fascinating, timely and important, and he gave us a tip. Read it and then pass it on to a friend. Welcome to this very interesting hour in the Brainwash Festival.
Thank you, Natasja.
Hi, Noreena. It's so exciting. I mean, you're supposed to sit next to me here in Amsterdam in this studio, and we should have been joined by 600 people in a, damp atmosphere in a theater. But we're now, I'm here alone. You are in your living room or in your study in London. We're alone.
I know. And my gosh, I would definitely rather be in Amsterdam with you all in person today, but so be it, and thank goodness that we're able to connect at least with technology and be alone together.
Yes, yeah. So your book is behind you on the bookshelves, The Lonely Century, and I've put it here on the table here in the studio in Amsterdam in the Dutch version, De Eenzame Eeuw. Het herstellen van menselijk contact in een wereld die steeds verder ontrafelt. So let's start by the beginning, of course. What is your definition of loneliness? Because it's broader than what we normally use it, like a personal thing. It's a broader definition for you.
Yes. So when we think about loneliness, we typically think of that feeling of craving companionship, intimacy, of feeling disconnected from our friends and family and craving that connection. And it is that, of course, too. But it's also, I argue, a feeling of being disconnected not only from our friends and family, but also from our government, our employer, a feeling of being invisible, unheard, unseen, whether we're talking about in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, or relative to our fellow citizens. So for me, loneliness is a personal state, but it's also a political state. It's also an existential state of being, determined by our economic circumstance, by our age, by the cities in which we live in, by the way that we use technology, by a whole host of drivers.
Yes. And so what prompted you, because you are, of course, a very acclaimed author in your analysis of economy, of neoliberalism, critiquing geopolitical phenomena, and now you were prone to look at loneliness. What happened?
Well, it was a few things happening at roughly the same time that made me think about loneliness as a way of understanding our contemporary world. The first was my students. More and more students, I was realizing, were coming into my office in office hours and confiding in me that they felt lonely and isolated. And this was a new phenomenon. And when we think about loneliness, we often think about it being something that's primarily affecting the elderly, but it's actually the young who are the loneliest generation. So I realized that my students were increasingly lonely. That was the first aha moment. The second thing was I was researching the rise of right-wing populism across the globe. In the United States, the rise of Donald Trump; in Italy, the rise of Salvini; in Germany, Alternative for Deutschland; in France, Le Pen. And as I interviewed and heard from right-wing populist voters, one thing that came across time and time again from their stories was how lonely they felt. Lonely in the sense of feeling a lack of friends and support systems, but also lonely in the sense of feeling unseen, unheard, invisible. And the third thing that happened at roughly the same time was I had bought an Alexa device. And I'm sorry if any of you have one in your rooms and she's now gone off, but I realized that I was becoming increasingly attached to my Alexa and feeling increasingly affectionate towards her. And that got me thinking about how the market was stepping in to respond to this growing loneliness crisis by creating products and services aimed at making people feel less lonely, and also attempting to deliver community as well. And so it was those three things: my lonely students, lonely right-wing populist voters, the loneliness economy arising, that made me start being really interested in this subject and wanting to understand why are we so lonely today? Because even before the pandemic, 1 in 5 adults were lonely, often or always. This is US data, but European data is pretty similar. 1 in 5 millennials said that they didn't have a single friend. Even before the pandemic, this was the lonely century. And I wanted to understand why this was. How had we got here? What were the consequences? And what could we do to come together again?
Yes. So very interesting. I mean, in the Netherlands, we've done the same in the same data or the same. What you have to do a questionnaire, right? And people put. If you put that, then you get a score. And I think in Amsterdam, 50% of the population say they have a certain amount, a feeling of loneliness.
And that would fit with data from other cities. Yes. So that's very comparable to over 50% of New Yorkers, over 50% of Londoners also feel lonely. And the lonely city is something that I look at actually in my book at depth, because we might think of cities as being not lonely places because we're all up against each other. But actually, I argue that cities are particularly lonely places for many because, filled with people who are just rushing, go, 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 not even looking at passers-by as they pass them. In fact, the richer a city, the faster its citizens walk. And the denser a city, the less civil people are to each other, it turns out. Yeah. So cities can be very lonely places.
Yeah. And as you show in your book, I mean, of course, it's that terrible for the people who are feeling lonely. I mean, it's affecting people's health. People are sicker because of it. But you also emphasize that, I mean, the consequences, you emphasize that it's really important that we practice skills for inclusive democracy. And this loneliness is not helping us to do so. We see a loss of that. practicing skills for inclusive democracy. What are those skills and why are they so relevant for you?
So when we're together with other people, when we're together face to face doing things with other people, especially people who are not necessarily like us, different ages, different genders, different socioeconomic groups. So for example, when we're walking around a supermarket and navigating our trolley, or if we're in a yoga class with other people, these are moments of coming together where we, I argue, practice inclusive democracy, moments where we have to be civil to those around us, where we have to think about others' needs, where we have to negotiate kind of our interests with their interests. One of the things I look at in the book is how increasingly we are embracing a contactless existence now, in which we're shopping online, in which we're ordering our food on delivery services, in which we're doing our yoga classes on Zoom. Now, of course, this had begun before the pandemic, but the pandemic has understandably and inevitably massively accelerated this. My fear is that if we choose the convenience of a contactless existence post-pandemic, in the process, we risk not practicing these fundamental skills that we actually need if we are to preserve a sense of inclusive democracy, that contactless and community and building community are actually at odds. And that's something I look at.
Yeah, and that, of course, makes it a really urgent and relevant phenomena we have to study, because I mean, a society which lacks democratic skills is of course a society which is prone to other types of society than a democratic one.
Yes, and for sure, and also society in which people are lonely risks also being one in which people are less tolerant to others. And I say this because of research done on lonely animals, actually, lonely mice in particular, where the researchers had a mouse in a cage, and what they discovered was the longer the mouse was isolated in its cage, the more violent and the more aggressive it was to a new mouse when the mouse was introduced into its cage. And so it is with lonely people. Of course, I'm not saying everyone who's lonely feels like this. I'm talking about averages, but on average, people who feel lonely are more hostile to outsiders, view the world as a more threatening, hostile place. There was research done on siblings, so brothers and sisters, and what they found who lived in the same physical space. And they found that the lonelier of the siblings saw the world as a more threatening, hostile place. So loneliness, these personal feelings of loneliness can have political ramifications, can have bigger societal ramifications. And that's the thing about loneliness. You know, when we think about loneliness, we think about it being something that affects our mental health. And it definitely does do that. And I don't want to understate how significant this is. And unfortunately, you know, we're seeing a very significant rise in mental health problems during this pandemic, as people have also felt increasingly lonely and isolated. We also know that loneliness is bad for our physical health. Loneliness is as bad for us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's that bad for our physical health. It's bad for our economy. In the Netherlands, I saw research that said that loneliness, just in terms of healthcare costs, is costing the Dutch government 2 billion euros a year, just in healthcare costs. But it's also affecting who people vote for. And that's I think, another dimension of loneliness that sometimes is overlooked.
Yeah, so quite a clear case you made now why we all should be worried, not just from a personal reason. You don't want people to feel awful, but also from a societal perspective. And let me just say to all the viewers, the festival, the participants of the festival, that you can send in questions. Some have already done that. For instance, Rob and Thijs, but they already want to go to the final part of this conversation with Noreena Hertz, talk about solutions. And of course, we understand that. And they want to talk, because of the broad definition you introduced in the beginning, they of course think that solutions should also be either societal, political, from the state or the government, or collectively. And we're gonna address that. But it's going to take us a little bit more longer, because we still want to make the analysis first and then the solutions. But Rob and Thijs, hang in, we will get there. Yes. Then in your book, you talk a lot about the influence of social media. You say it makes the world meaner and crueler. But can you explain how this, well, the rise of social media and the importance it's now has in society, what that does with this topic of loneliness?
Yes. So I began my research very agnostic about the role that social media played in today's loneliness crisis. But having spent a few years really digging into the scientific literature and also interviewing significant numbers of teenagers, I came away feeling very strongly that social media is playing a significant role in loneliness. If you look, for example, at young people's rising levels of loneliness, we see a steep rise and increasing levels of loneliness from about 2010, which is, of course, when smartphones started becoming ubiquitous, and really loneliness rising in lockstep with social media usage. Now, you might think, understandably, it would be a reasonable thought. You might think, well, maybe it's coincidental, just the fact that they're rising in parallel doesn't necessarily imply that they are causally related. Or you might think this is because lonely people are using social media more. And it was probably only about 2 years ago that we could effectively and clearly say, no, it really is that people who use social media become lonelier as a result, because there was some seminal research conducted out of Stanford University, where they did a very impressive, very gold standard of a study, where they had 3,000 students brought into the study. 1,500 were a control group. They were told to use Facebook like usual. The other 1,500 were told to stop using Facebook for 2 months. And then the researchers, tracked what they did, how they felt, their behavior. And what they found was unambiguous. The people who stopped using Facebook spent considerably more time doing things in person with friends and family. And they also were significantly happier and significantly less lonely. In fact, the researchers said that deleting Facebook was almost half as good for your mental health as seeing a therapist, which was quite astounding, really. But why social media is prone to making many people feel so lonely is, I think, a number of reasons. First of all, because these platforms are intentionally designed to be so addictive, to really draw our attention away from those around us, from those who are even physically around us. So, our social media, we're drawn to our feeds and at the expense of those often who are physically around us. So they're diminishing our face-to-face relationships. They're also making us lonelier because of how toxic the environment, many people's social media feeds are. Filled with hateful rhetoric, polarizing, or even just depicting pictures of others who always seem to be more popular than you, have more friends than you. So in relative terms, making people feel less popular, less lonely, and often people themselves receiving hatred on these media too. I mean, a surprisingly high number of people, 65% of British students have actively experienced cyberbullying. And of course, a world in which you're being bullied is going to feel a lonelier world. And then there's the excluding nature of these media, especially for the young who have migrated so much of their social lives onto these platforms. So, if you're not invited to a WhatsApp group, or if you see your friends out there having fun without you to something you didn't even know about and you witness it on your feeds, you're inevitably going to feel more excluded. And what perhaps is even worse and more poignant is that the exclusion is all too apparent to your peers, but not apparent to especially when we talk about children, to the children's parents or another adult in their lives. Yeah. So the shame of exclusion is public, and yet those who might be able to intervene and help are often not aware it's going on. Yeah. And, many of the teenagers I interviewed, their stories were very, very poignant and heartfelt of being, scrolling through feeds, seeing people out without them, posting on social media, waiting, hoping for people to like their posts, and no one liking them. So for a whole host of reasons, I think social media has a lot to answer for in today's loneliness crisis, for sure.
As soon as we talk about solutions and also political action for that, we will get into that. Hans is asking you whether you think that the word social is wrong and we should stop calling it social media.
Yes, well, they, of course, cleverly branded it as such. So, Hans, I think you're absolutely right. And maybe we should rename it anti-social media, which is actually much more apt.
Yes. Another question coming in from Jelle. Hans Jelle, he wants to know, because you also in the social media, you focus on the youth. And you also mentioned already that although some people would think it's affecting the elderly more, it's affecting actually youth more. He asked whether we neglect now the loneliness of elderly too much.
That's a really good question. And even though the young are the loneliest, the data and the stories around elderly loneliness are very painful. In the United States, 60% of elderly people who live in old people's home, nursing homes, never have a single visitor, which is really heartbreaking. Yeah. In Japan, the fastest growing demographic of people going to jail are the elderly, people over 70, because there's so many people of that age group feeling lonely that they're intentionally committing relatively minor crimes like shoplifting in order to be jailed, in order to find the company and care they crave within the jails. Yeah. So, I'm not by any means underemphasizing how lonely, how pervasive loneliness is amongst the elderly, for sure as well. But I think historically that was the age group that people assumed were more likely to be lonely, and it was the young who people didn't assume to be lonely. Although I don't know how old the questioner is, and if you're young,
me neither.
It may be so obvious to you that so many of your peers are lonely because latest Dutch data from during the pandemic suggests that as many as half of Dutch 18 to 24-year-olds are currently during the pandemic feeling lonely.
Yeah, it was one of the reasons why the government, the cabinet now decided last week to reopen the high schools for a day a week, because the signals of loneliness and mental issues with young people are really getting there. I mean, getting out there. Yes. Thank you for those questions. Let me go to another part of your analysis, and that is the neoliberal policy. And there are two questions about that already. And that is, Mariano wants to know whether there is a relationship with development or the state of development of the country. And she says, is it harder or deeper in highly developed countries with a soft, with annotation, neoliberalism, or in countries like Latin America, where they are dealing with a much more brutal form of neoliberalism? So that is interesting, I think, to discuss. And the other thing is there a difference in your data in certain countries? Are some societies doing better than others?
Great questions. This is obviously a very smart audience, which I
Mariana was the one if we see them in the audience, it would have been great. But Mariana was the brilliant question with the high developed, and Bernadette was asking societies questions, examples of where we can learn from. Thank you so much for these questions.
Yeah, thank you. So I think those are both really interesting questions. What we know from the data is that loneliness is not exclusively a Western phenomenon. We're seeing rising levels of loneliness as far afield as China, South Africa, and India as well. But what we also know is that the more individualistic a country, the likelier its citizens are to feel lonely. And of course, when it comes to the continuum of individualism, Western countries still tend to be ahead of the game there. But it is interesting that we're seeing loneliness across the world now rising. And I would argue that, this is, as Mariana, you're suggesting with your question, linked to the widespread adoption of what we might think of as neoliberal capitalism. So the particular form of capitalism that became dominant really globally from the 1980s, initially spearheaded by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the kind of dog-eat-dog, greed is good form of capitalism in which values like competitiveness were hyper-valorized, and values such as caring, compassion, community were undervalued or even ignored. And, we've really seen this kind of what I call the neoliberal mindset take hold within countries as people came to feel, see themselves as more self-interested, more selfish, more self-focused, arguably a rational response to a world in which the state was withdrawing, and if I don't look out for myself, well, then who will? And we even see this rise in individualistic, me-focused mindset in pop song lyrics, which from the 1980s onwards have become increasingly less collectivist, with words such as we, us, and our in lyrics increasingly replaced by words such as me, myself, and I. And a me-focused world was always inevitably going to be a lonelier world.
Yes, so that is an explanation for the question on whether there is a difference between societies. And then the relationship with is there a relationship between the form of the brutality of the neoliberalism policies, like mentioned by the question of, but the question where she refers to Brazil, for instance, of Latin America?
So I don't have Latin America data in particular, but if we're talking about, so I think neoliberalism is a clear driver for today's loneliness crisis, partly because of the neoliberal mindset, so partly because we've become more individualistic and me-focused, but also partly because of the economic outcomes that neoliberalism has delivered. Insofar as we've witnessed increasing and growing levels of inequality of wealth and income over the past few decades, and also a significant group of people feeling, in economic terms, left behind, forsaken.
Yeah.
And even though loneliness can affect anyone, rich or poor, what we do know is that if you are on a low income, or if you're unemployed, you are more likely to feel lonely. So I think there's another element of neoliberalism at play there, which is creating an unlevel playing field in which significant numbers of people do feel marginalized, left behind. Some of that group, of course, the same group who are finding, who believe that they are being seen and heard by right-wing populist candidates. Whether or not they really are, of course, is a different matter.
Yeah. So let's elaborate a little bit on that then, because I wanted to go to the workplace, because you have a brilliant chapter about that as well. I mean, it was for me, finally, I found the acknowledgement of that, these open offices, which I always hate, and now I know why. But thank you for that. But let's elaborate a bit on that, because you say one of the 3 reasons you wanted to research loneliness was this research you did on populist right-wing parties. And of course, you mentioned in your book Hannah Arendt's research, you related to her, where she said in her analysis of totalitarianism that there is a relationship with loneliness. It's connected. Can you explain a little bit more about that relationship? Because we've mentioned it now a few times in the interview already, but I think it would be interesting to elaborate a little bit about that.
Sure. So my first insight into this even being an issue with right-wing populist voters was from their testimonies and interviews, when loneliness was a theme that came up in them. People like Eric, the French baker, who is an ardent supporter of Marine Le Pen, who told me about how lonely he felt until he found community in his fellow Rassemblement National members, with whom he would go leafleting and afterwards go and have drinks with in the bar every Wednesday evening. Or Giorgio, the small business owner in Milan, who told me how lonely he felt until he found community in the dinners he would have on a regular basis with fellow League members in Italy, where they would come and eat together and sing traditional songs. Or the loneliness felt by Trump voters, who I heard from railroad workers in East Tennessee, for example, traditionally Democrat voters who historically for many generations had voted Democrat, them and their families, but who now, in an era in which they had lost their jobs, lost the brotherhood of the union, told me that they were finding community in the Trump rallies where everyone wore the same branded clothes and sang the same songs and chanted the same chants. So a lonely group of people feeling lonely, bereft of friends, finding companionship and community in these right-wing populist gatherings, for sure.
Yes. You even mentioned that he was probably inspired by church gatherings, right? I mean, you give an image. I've never read an analysis of Trump rallies, but you say it really mimics a church happening.
Absolutely, very much this kind of congregation, repeating the refrains together in unison, this sense of shared communion. Yeah. But right-wing populist voters speaking also to the other aspect of loneliness that that is part of my definition, speaking, of course, very clearly and very explicitly to the sense of forsakenness that so many feel. Yeah. The forgotten people, you are the forgotten people, I hear you, is the kind of thing that both Trump or Le Pen said. And of course, there are lots of people who feel lonely and marginalized for different reasons, but there is a particular group, arguably, who we might think of as newly lonely. White working class men in particular, so groups who, historically didn't feel marginalized, historically felt that they had status, but who have lost that. So the newly lonely in that sense, to whom right-wing populists are speaking particularly effectively. And of course, the community that right-wing populists proffer is a very exclusive and excluding form of community, defined as much by who it doesn't allow in, as well as who is allowed in. That's for sure. But they do it very effectively, right-wing populists. They have effectively weaponized community and preyed on a group of lonely, vulnerable people to great effect.
Yeah, and they give the people in the audience meanings, they self-respect again, acknowledgement. So you
and a sense of belonging.
Exactly.
And we all want to feel that we belong somewhere.
Yeah, interesting. So it's we have now dealt with some of the causes, right? You mentioned only briefly in your book. It has some chapters. I mean, the lonely city, the lonely workplace. I mean, it's everywhere. Once you start looking with the lens of loneliness to society, you see it everywhere, right? Maybe you can share your insights on the open workspaces we now all have in all of our office buildings, and also the products which are created, like the co-sharing workspace stuff, which is the market now offers to us, and the effect, and why you found that really interesting as to research.
Yes. So, the lonely workplace. So I was really interested. I came across data which suggested that as much as 40% of office workers, even before the pandemic, felt lonely at work. I wanted to understand more why this was. And interestingly, one clear factor has been the move to open plan offices. And this is pretty counterintuitive, because you might have thought that an open plan office where people are kind of facing each other, seeing each other all day long, would actually be a more connected one where people felt closer to each other. But actually, researchers who investigated tracked a company where people moved from offices and cubicles to an open plan space, found that instead of communicating more face-to-face with each other, people actually communicated far less, and instead communicated much more via email or via messaging apps like Slack. And it makes sense, if you've ever worked in an open plan office, you may know what I'm talking about. Firstly, the noise. So many people, when I worked in open plan offices, my way of coping was to have noise cancelling headphones and put them on. And of course, people sitting there with headphones is hardly a recipe to come and talk to me. I mean, if there's ever a signal, stay away, it's those headphones. The other reason is the panoptic nature of the open plan office. So the sense that everyone's watching you, seeing you, you're seeing everyone else, is never going to lead to an environment where people are going to feel able to be their authentic selves when they feel that they're constantly going to be watched. And so the level of conversation is inevitably going to be more superficial and much more guarded, and therefore the quality of relationships going to be so much poorer. And and even worse, offices which have bought into hot desking. So this is when you don't even have your own desk, but each day you come in and you take whatever desk is available. There was one woman I interviewed in my book who had to have an operation, and she was not at work for a month. And it took her colleagues a few weeks to even notice that she wasn't there, because she never sat at the same desk. They didn't even realize she wasn't there. And yet, even from an employer's point of view, purely looking at this from an employer's point of view, loneliness is bad for business. Lonely workers are less productive, less efficient, less motivated, more likely to leave a company than workers who are not. In fact, the single biggest determinant for whether someone will be productive at work is whether they have a friend at work. And yet, workplaces are often very lonely places for many, many people.
Yes.
in them.
So the work, the quality of the work is affected. So actually what we produce as a society is, I think, affected. And the quality of relationships are affected. So it's a lose-lose situation in every way. So if there are people who are employers, please listen to this, this because it's just data. A question from Anke van der Wield to you, because she's now listening to our conversation and she's thinking whether is loneliness a result of a lack of attention, or is it the result of exponential growth of the need for attention? She wants to know. Interesting question.
That's a great question.
Interesting.
Well, we know that loneliness, even the phrase, the word loneliness only really entered the English language in around the 18th century. And part of the reason it's a kind of a relatively modern concept, it's thought, is because before then, people didn't feel lonely because they had a sense of feeling connected to God. And as people started questioning that bond and that relationship and started kind of thinking more of themselves relative to other people, they started having feelings of loneliness. So we might be able to extrapolate from that when we weren't craving kind of connection explicitly with other people, we didn't from other people as much as we felt less lonely. But on the other hand, we also know that in evolutionary terms, even, we are hardwired to connect, that we are creatures of togetherness, that we are social animals. And so at a very fundamental level, we do want to be with other people. We want to feel connected to other people. And that's why this past year has been so hard for most of us, because it's going against every single kind of innate trait of being human, which is to be around and with other people. So I think that's a really interesting question. Is it our need for attention is that growing, and is that helping make us lonelier? Probably to some degree, yes. And that's why social media is kind of amplifying that sense of relative having less attention, less friends, less popular than others. So I think that's playing part of the role. And yet there is something just fundamental in us as humans, our craving to be with others, which contemporary society is making increasingly hard.
Yeah. But you get a strange norm, right? I mean, I know that a few years ago, it was just LinkedIn, and everybody was trying to get a 500 plus friends, because then there wasn't an amount anymore in your face the entire day. It was just 500 plus. But if you have 349 friends, that sounds like, okay, I'm not important enough. So it's kind of like the comparison, of course, with the others, the relative the competition you get and how many friends do you have and how popular are you is perhaps amplifying, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and the platforms, of course, and the platforms kind of play to this, of course, with, where you post and you hope that your post will be liked or retweeted, and you're looking at those metrics, that social validation.
Yeah.
Even, of course, we know that, that whole form of communication is like the fast food equivalent of communication, where we can gorge on it but never feel sated or full or satisfied.
Yeah. I want to go to the last part of this interview and talk about solutions. Your analysis is broader than what we just. Well, we talked about now in 40 minutes. Everybody has to read your book and then pass it on to a friend. But before we do so, Shauman wants to know who we can blame. So he asks, okay, should anyone be blamed for the current anti-social societal system? Can we just put the blame on somebody, because that would also help us finding the right solutions?
Well, I think there are so many drivers. So there's lots of factors at play here, from social media companies, clearly a group we can definitely blame, but also, from the way we've designed our cities, cities designed around cars, not people, so not designed to deliver community. From the underinvestment governments across the globe have made, especially since 2008 and the financial crisis, in what we might think of as the infrastructure of community, in public parks, in libraries, in daycare centres, in elderly care centres, in community centres. People need physical spaces to be together if we are to come together, and also if we are able to practice those skills of inclusive democracy that we spoke about. So underfunding of infrastructure of community, a clear factor. But there's also things that we're doing differently. We do less with each other, with other people, than we did in the past. We are less likely to live with others. We're less likely to eat with others. We're less likely to be members of a trade union, less likely to be members of parent-teacher associations, less likely to go to church. So, we do less with other people than in the past. That's also a factor. And, and we need to take, our workplaces have become more lonely. We've talked about some of the reasons. There are other reasons there as well, but things that employers clearly will need to do. But also we, as a society, have become more atomized, more individualistic, and less caring of each other. And that, of course, is taking its toll as well.
Okay, so many to blame, and now let's find these practical solutions, and perhaps we can divide that in what we should do publicly on government level, whether it be, as you already mentioned in your book, the federal or state level or national level in the Netherlands, or the city level governments. But what can we do politically or in public policy? What can we what can institutions like employers do, companies, and then perhaps community, and then the self, us as individuals watching from our home in this festival. So let's go to who should do what. Let's first go to public policy, government action. What can they do to actually, solve this immense crisis?
So a lot that government can do, both at a federal level and at a local level.
Yeah.
I'll just throw out some ideas. My book's full of different ideas on this front, but I'll just throw out a few. At a local level, refunding the infrastructure of community is absolutely critical. So more money needs to go into public libraries, public parks, public spaces where people can do things together. That's inevitable. Yeah. Especially now, post-pandemic, governments are going to need to give significant help to our local stores and cafes, our local businesses who've really suffered during the pandemic, facing the triple whammy of an economic downturn, of having to be closed during periods of lockdown, and the shift to contactless shopping, e-commerce, that we're witnessing, and that has accelerated massively over the past few months. We need our local stores, our local cafes. They serve as anchors to our communities. They nurture us, and governments should recognize this. There are things governments...
Yeah, you refer in your book to, I think, a Belgian government, right?
Yeah.
A local government, Roeselare.
Yes, exactly, which I really like that scheme. It's an empty shop tax. So this is a tax put on landlords if they leave their shops empty, waiting for people who'll who'll be willing to pay higher prices, which is often the problem in cities. It's a big problem in London. I think it's also a problem in Amsterdam, where
Absolutely.
you see these empty stores which have been empty for months because the landlord's holding out for higher rents.
Yeah.
Well, what they've done in Roeselare in Belgium is they've now got a tax whereby the longer a landlord leaves the shop empty, they have to pay a tax on this. I think we could also have a new tax status for businesses that are demonstrably pro-community, so that those businesses could pay lower business rates, lower local taxes, etc. That could be a significant step. There's also moves that can be made at a local level about creating spaces, physical spaces, neighborhoods that are more conducive to community. And in Barcelona, for example, superblocks have been set up across the city, pedestrianized areas where cars are banned. We know from research that the less cars there are riding in a neighborhood, the more cohesive the neighborhood is, the more friends people have within that neighborhood. Makes sense. You're more likely to let your kids play in the area and hang out on your streets if you're not going to be worried about being run over by a car or the pollution of the cars. So that's another area to look at moving forward. And I know during the pandemic, we are seeing more experimentation on that front. At a national level, I think right now, clearly with a really significant and acute loneliness crisis, we need to see significant government funds going into dealing with the acute loneliness crisis we're witnessing today. And I know that the Dutch government has committed some money into addressing actually young people's loneliness in particular brought on by the pandemic, and that's a positive. But also, we can go even further. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, she has now put well-being at the very heart of New Zealand's entire budgetary process. So no longer looking at traditional economic metrics like gross domestic product, GDP, exclusively, but also looking at how lonely her citizens feel, at how trusting they are towards each other and how much trust they have in the government, and looking at improving measurements on those fronts with her policies in an active way as well. And governments also have a lot to do in helping us come together more broadly, because of course alleviating loneliness isn't just about alleviating loneliness at an individual level, it's also about strengthening bonds between citizens and bridging different communities. And there's a lot that governments can do on that front. Emmanuel Macron, for example, in France, has piloted civic service, national service for teenagers, whereby he has had a scheme which he ran in 2019, where a group of teenagers came, they lived together, they worked together, they did voluntary work together for a number of months from all different ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups, different parts of society. Again, people doing things with people different like you is a great way to create more cohesion. So that's stuff that governments can do.
Yeah, clear. It's almost an invitation you invite policy makers with the lens of loneliness to look at their field of work, whether it be in infrastructure or in designing taxes or benefits or even the statistical departments, right? How you report on the success of your country. You say, with the lens of loneliness, if you agree with you that this is a major crisis, there is a lot of opportunity to change policies in the right direction. So it's a broad variety of policy options. Thank you. Yeah. So that is what governments can do, right? So let's now go to what communities can do. We as groups of people, and we as citizens, individuals.
Yes. In our workplace, of course, there is stuff that can be done, a lot that employers can do. One very simple thing is when we're back in the office, and I do believe that this is not the new normal and that remote work isn't going to be the only way we work moving forwards. I think there is a craving to go back into the office by many people.
You actually urge in your book employers not to see the economic benefits which they now see, and some are even already renting out offices because they think this is the new normal. You say, please don't.
No, and one very simple thing when we're back in the office is encourage employees to eat together. You don't need to put on fancy canteens. You don't need to pay for the food. Even just have a room with a nice table where people are encouraged to actually come together and eat together. It's one of the best ways of bringing your staff together. And again, it's a win for the employer. There was research done with firefighters in America. The researchers wanted to understand why certain firefighting platoons did better than others, performed better than others. They found the single biggest determinant was whether they ate together. And a lot that we can do, of course, as individuals as well. One thing we can do, put down our phones more and be more present with each other. That's really, really important. Another thing we can do is we can actively support our local communities, our local stores. Buy your books in your local bookshops, support your local cafes, support your local stores, especially now, given how much they're likely to be struggling. This is really important. Remembering that those micro exchanges we have in our local shops, that 30-second conversation we have at our greengrocer, at our butchers, at our bookstore, really help us feel more connected to each other and to our local community. The third thing we can do, if we are to help alleviate the loneliness crisis at an individual level, is value kindness more in others, whether it is in our colleagues, in our friends, or in our family members. Kindness isn't something we've really valued enough as a society in recent years, and I would suggest remedying that. And the final thing that we can do right now is think about whether there's anyone in our own network who might be feeling lonely and actively reach out to them. Even just send them a text. If you can, pick up the phone to them. If you can, meet them in a socially distanced 1.5 meter rule way. Just showing someone that you care, that you see them, that they're visible to you can make a huge difference to how they feel.
Yeah, you show in your book the data that even shallow contacts with strangers have actually a positive effect on your well-being. It's not just deep relationships you should look after, but also very ordinary, just niceness between strangers can already have an effect.
Definitely. And, now when I don't know how strict lockdown is in Amsterdam at the moment, but in London, it's still very strict and you're not allowed to have anyone come to your house. You're not even allowed to meet a friend outside on the street for a coffee. There are no restaurants and cafes that are open even for sitting outside. So it's very draconian at the moment. And so even when I'm walking down the street, I'm really try and consciously, with my mask on, nod as I walk by, say hello to the people who are walking by, because even those tiny exchanges do make a difference to them, but also to us.
Yes. That's related to we're almost at the end of this session, but there are two questions. Anke van der Wild, she says, sounds like we want to focus on ourselves, be focused on ourselves, but also at the same time feel lonely. Should we start to focus on others and get attention from others as a return, but not as a focus? So should we just pay more attention to others and less to the self?
Yes, inevitably, yes. And one way of doing that, of course, is by actively being involved in some sort of voluntary work, some way that you help others. And again, helping others is another one of those win-wins. Exactly. You'll make someone else feel significant better, but you'll also make yourself feel less lonely, happier, more connected, and it turns out you'll be healthier as well. People who help others live longer than people who don't.
Yes, thank you so much. This is almost a brilliant end, but there's always a last question after the last question, and that is from Janina Toussaint, and she wants to know how we can stay away with this plea from a romanticized idea of loneliness in the past, the exclusion in small communities, where the dominance of the norm, etc., etc. So she says this cannot be a plea for going back to these communities which, decided a lot of the norms in how to live a good life.
Yes, I absolutely hear what you're saying, Shanina, and it's something that I talk about in the book. I say, let's not romanticize community. Community can also be exclusive, excluding,
suffocating,
have norms which if you transgress, you're then not welcomed in. So for me, the challenge is, one, how do we bridge different communities? I think that's really, really important. Two, however, recognizing that sometimes in life there are trade-offs we need to make. Trade-offs between contactless existence and the convenience that it gives, convenience and community. Trade-offs between competitiveness and compassion, and trade-offs at times between two, anonymity and fraternity. And some of these trade-offs, are worth making, I think, so that we can come together again and feel more connected to each other. We built a lonely world, but it doesn't have to remain so.
Thank you so much, Noreena Hertz, for this brilliant talk. Thank you. And thank you to all the participants of this festival for joining us here, through the digital world, because I don't see anybody surrounding us now. But thank you so much. In half an hour, you are welcomed as a festival participant to join in a Brainwash breakout rooms. They are in Dutch and in English if you want to continue this conversation among with other festival participants. Please do so in about half an hour. Join in then. And for now, thank you for watching. And thank you, Noreena Hertz, for joining us.
Thank you so much. And goodbye, everyone. I hope next time to see you in the flesh.
Oh, I hope so. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.